Right, hello everybody. Welcome and thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar on systems thinking, how to address highly complex problems. So I'm Jess Frenberg and I will be the chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at UEA, University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. Also with me today helping out is my colleague, Professor Neil Ward, who's also at UEA. So if this is your first webinar or interaction with us, just to let you know, AFN is a £5 million UKRI funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the agri-food system. We currently have around 1,700 members across the UK. So please do join if you haven't already. I'll put links in the chat shortly. So on to today's topic. Anyone who's tried to unravel and address problems in the agri-food system will know how complex it is, not least when you're trying to figure out how to move towards a more sustainable, healthy, and equitable one. There are often multiple, interlinked, and overlapping issues that have to be considered, and addressing one might make another worse. Solutions are often change depending on different people's perspectives, realities, values, as well as power relations and uncertainty. So trying to address these sorts of complex problems is where systems thinking can help. And I'm very pleased today that our speaker will be leading us through all of this complexity. So Professor Gerald Midgley has been researching systems thinking and systems leadership for 40 years. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Hull and a visiting professor at the Birmingham Leadership Institute at the University of Birmingham and at Linnaeus University in Sweden. Gerald has worked across academia, industry and government, including in New Zealand. So if you have any questions as we go along, please write them in the Q&A panel. We'll have about 30 minutes or so at the end for questions. Feel free to use the chat for discussion, sharing relevant links, that sort of thing. But if you can keep your questions in the Q&A panel, then I can find them easily afterwards. So we're going to record the session, as we always do, and put it on YouTube so that others can see it. So if you don't want to be identified as participating for any reason, best not to ask a question or do so anonymously. So Gerald, over to you. If you could just get your slides ready and take it away.
Right. So I'm going to talk about systems thinking and how to address highly complex problems using it. And this is broadly what I want to cover as an introduction. So I'll give some characteristics of highly complex problems. And if systems thinking is what we're saying can help with it, I'm going to give a basic introduction to what systems thinking is. Then I'll give you 4 different systems approaches for different purposes with lots of practical examples. And the practical examples are all from my own projects over the past 30 years. So the most recent one is maybe 1 or 2 months old. The oldest ones are back in the 1990s. I actually don't think the age of the project matters. It's their relevance really for contemporary times that matters. And some of the examples are food systems examples, others are other kinds of social issues. So in tackling what is systems thinking, I think it's worth saying before anything else that there's been over 100 years now of research in this space, and it covers everything from physics and biology through to family therapy and management. I can't cover anywhere near that variety of ideas. So I'm going to focus on policy and management ideas, which I think are the ones that are going to be most relevant to people dealing with food systems ideas. It's also worth saying that I think the systems thinking ideas came to a tipping point around 2017 and since then have really been picking up steam in terms of implementation. And what triggered that tipping point is the UN, the WHO, World Health Organization, and the OECD all at the same time calling for a systems approach to join up the Sustainable Development Goals. So that really created massive interest in government, and that spilled out across the board. Um, so the projects I'm going to talk about, some of them are from the UK, some of them are from New Zealand, where I worked in New Zealand government for 7 years, and one of them is from Nigeria as well. And then I'll end with some key principles for a flexible and responsive practice if you want to adopt some of these ideas yourself. And if I've got time, I'll share some cartoons at the end. So here are some characteristics of highly complex problems. Um, uh, Jez mentioned earlier on how issues can be linked up. In the food systems context, we're often needing to deal with health, environment, economic issues, social issues, all interconnecting, and needing to deal with the interactions between them. Um, because you've got all those things you're concerned about, there are usually multiple agencies involved, all trying to address different aspects of the issue, and they could be at multiple scales, from very local right through to regional, national, and global organizations. When you've got that many stakeholders with different things that they're concerned with, you're inevitably going to get really different views on what the problems are, what potential solutions could be, and that can often give rise to conflict. So it could be conflict over uh, what the desired outcomes of a food system are, or it could be conflict over the means to achieve those outcomes. And often power relationships can make change difficult. And then you have pervasive uncertainty as well because of the complexity. So if those are the characteristics of highly complex problems, um, and I'm saying that systems thinking can help address them, let's ask what systems thinking actually is. And for this purpose, I'm going to split the term systems thinking into two, and I'm going to deal with thinking first. And then I'll move on to explain a little bit about what it means when you put the word systems in front of thinking. So this slide was actually created by my daughter, who's a digital sculptor. And when she heard I was giving this talk, she said, "Let me do a brain for you." So there it is. So it's not a naive notion of thinking. Um, Most people tend to think that thinking is just what goes on in your head. There are actually three dimensions to thinking, all of which are fundamentally relational. So there's what goes on in your head, with concepts and ideas being related together. There's what goes on with other people. So you use language, which is socially shared, which enables you to think between people so that synergies happen and new ideas arise. And the third dimension is in relation to feedback with the material world. So our thinking is fundamentally relational and three-dimensional in that sense, in your head, with other people, and in relation to the world. The other thing to note about thinking is that thinking and emotion are part of one single cognitive system. So the old idea that we have to suppress emotions somehow and um, and focus on the thinking side without the emotion is actually impossible, because every thought is accompanied by a feeling that then gets interpreted as emotion. And our cognitive systems are inherently anticipatory. And that's maybe an unusual word, so I'll explain what I mean by it. Um, it means if you think about the consciousness you have and how you're seeing a room around you now, what that is not simply a reflection of what's in the world. It's your construction of what you think might be relevant to you just moments from now. So what we see around us is not simply the world we live in, but what we think is about to happen. And that is based on our past experiences. So we're continually anticipating, and we're always drawing on our past experiences. The interesting thing about this is that it's the most efficient way of, um, of, of thinking, to be able to anticipate in that way. And one of the least efficient elements of thinking is error correction. So a lot of the time, we're actually seeing what we expect to see based on our past experiences. And we only error correct a little bit. And in some senses, systems thinking can help us deal with that inevitable partiality that comes from that. It helps us with that. So if that's what thinking is, let's ask what a system is. And you'll see on the screen here a representation of a system. There are parts here in the system that are all related together. So relationships is a fundamental idea in systems thinking. Um, these parts and relationships give rise to emergent properties. That means they're properties of the system that can't be understood just in relation to one part of the system, but are only meaningful in relation to the whole. And a simple and obvious example is your own life as an emergent property of your body. So your body has organs that are organized together in a particular way that allows you to live. If you were just a random heap of organs on the floor, you wouldn't be alive. So that's a simple example of an emergent property. A system has a boundary. That means we can say what we think is in the system and what is outside the system. And boundaries are inevitably always seen from a particular perspective. Um, the interesting thing also about taking perspectives is that we take perspectives from within the system, not from outside it. So actually, the woman I've put on the picture really belongs within the system here. So often we hear systems people giving a definition of system and missing out that idea of the fact that systems are always seen from a perspective, but it's a really important element of understanding systems. Now you can move from that basic idea of a system to look at some systems concepts and skills. This is a framework that I've adapted from Derek and Laura Cabrera, who are systems thinkers at Cornell in the States. And thinking about the way I described a system earlier, I mentioned the boundary, I mentioned relationships, I mentioned the system idea itself and how it has emergent properties, and I mentioned the perspectives you take. So you can abstract out those concepts from that idea of system. And that allows you to identify some key systems thinking skills. So exploring boundaries, for example, mapping different relationships, understanding how systems produce different emergent properties, and appreciating multiple perspectives. So those are four core systems thinking skills. Um, and systems thinking is very close to critical thinking in really in two senses. So we're continually using systems thinking to rethink things. So we might ask, for example, what happens if I use a different boundary? What if I include these stakeholders that I hadn't thought about before? How does that change what I'm seeing? Changing what relationships you focus on, changing what emergent properties you see. So some stakeholders might be really in a food system, might be really focused on the profitability of their enterprises. Others might be focused on health. They may then see um, uh, uh, climate change as an emergent property as well. So you can actually look at multiple emergent properties and you can take different perspectives on a system too. So that's all about critical thinking. And I talked earlier about how our thinking is fundamentally anticipatory. We see largely what we expect to see. And by changing the boundaries we look at, by mapping different relationships, by looking at different emergent properties, by taking different perspectives, we can begin to see different possibilities for how we can think about systems. The other thing is that if you see one of these things, then you can look for the others as well. So let's say you meet a stakeholder with quite a different perspective to you. You can think, well, from their perspective, what relationships are they seeing? What boundaries are they assuming? And what emergent properties can they see? So it helps enrich the complexity of what you can see. Now, when I first came across that framework, I realized that it really helps you to begin to see uh, how you can map different systems approaches. Even within the area of policy and management, there are hundreds of different methodologies, uh, ways to intervene in complex systems. And when I saw the framework, I realized it really helps you because different approaches actually prioritize different systems thinking skills. So all of the mature ones involve all the skills, but they tend to put one up front. So there are approaches for exploring value judgments and boundary judgments, for example, to help you decide what should be included in your analysis or excluded from it. There are approaches for understanding complex causality and mapping systems and seeing the possible consequences of change. There are approaches for actually looking at organizations as systems right from local to global scale. And there are approaches for exploring multiple perspectives and addressing conflict, developing better mutual understanding between stakeholders, and agreeing solutions that people are willing to implement. So broadly speaking, there are these four types of systems approach. And there are multiple examples within each one. But what I'm going to do is walk you through one example from each of these four categories and then gives you plenty of practical case study examples too. So I'm going to start up here with approaches for exploring value and boundary judgments. So I'm going to compress 50 years of research on boundaries into about 5 minutes. So forgive me for the kind of compression of these ideas. And there's a visual language for diagramming boundaries here. You can see the oval here represents a boundary. That means the inclusion of stakeholders and the issues that concern them, but it also means the exclusion of stakeholders and issues as well, because boundaries simultaneously enable people to be heard and issues to be dealt with, but they also disable other people being heard and their issues being dealt with. So the peak here represents people's judgments on what should be done or what could be done. And these two things are always interconnected. So boundaries of relevance get set by people really pursuing particular purposes, looking at what they think should be done, and that constrains who and what they think is going to be relevant. But also within our organizations and institutions, our organizations make a lot of boundary judgments for us, and that constrains what we see and also, therefore, what purposes we pursue and what we think should be done. And it's often the hardening of views on purpose and what should be done that helps embed conflict. People get hardened boundary judgments and hardened views of what should be. And systems thinking can help make that a little more flexible. So we can understand conflict in this way. What you have here is two of these same diagrams. So you have one stakeholder group making one boundary judgment and another making another, and there's an overlap area. And so certainly when I was working in New Zealand, I did a lot of work with farmers and with policymakers working and with NGOs. Um, a repeated situation I came across is conflict over water resources and how water is seen. So the typical conflict was often with farmers who would see the water as an opportunity for irrigation. So what they think should be done is drawing the water and maintaining the profitability of their enterprises. And conservationists, on the other hand, seeing water as a habitat for fragile species. So what they're all about is pursuing the preservation of biodiversity. And when you begin to then get mutual stigmatization, the conflict really starts to entrench. So you hear sometimes conservationists talking about farmers as greedy profiteers, and farmers sometimes talking about conservationists as tree huggers. And when you get those kinds of stereotypes emerging, it actually really begins to harden the boundaries and harden people's views on what should be done. And we can intervene in this kind of conflict and address this kind of conflict using systems approaches. And I'm going to give you an example. So this is an example from Daniel Afua, who was one of my PhD students. He graduated in 2018. He did a project in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, working with a food production company, large food production company, looking at waste reduction. And so it's essentially a lean production project. Now, in most lean projects, there's a focus on internal stakeholders, maybe on supply chains, occasionally on government, if government regulation matters in the context. And those are the kind of obvious stakeholders. But he wanted to go beyond that. He wanted to see what would happen if you extended participation to the local community, the host community. And that was particularly relevant because this was the largest employer in the region. So within the company itself, there were lots of problems of waste management that people identified, and I'm just going to share one story. Um, so chicken production was the largest part of the business, but the business had a very unreliable electricity supply. So often the electricity would fail for several days. Whenever that happened, often uh, whole batches of eggs and newborn chicks would die in the hatchery, and that was really a significant waste issue. And the company asked us to tackle this. Um, but as I said, Daniel went out to the community and he got local people involved. And the story he heard from them was totally different, and a story that the company hadn't told him at all. He said the company is actually dumping animal effluent, dung, corpses, animal body parts right near the community, and that the smell and the public health risk is really considerable. So the local people had complained. The management had moved the dump further away, but it still really hadn't changed the situation. People were still complaining about it. They had a residents committee, and the residents had stopped talking with the company and refused to engage anymore. And they had called in environmental protection from the national government, who was beginning to implement an escalating series of fines on the company. And as a result of that, the company had put a halt on its expansion plans because it knew that if it expanded, it would just be creating more waste. So we talked with the various stakeholders, and they were willing to engage with it. And one of the key solutions that emerged out of this is actually to generate biogas from the waste. And that essentially meant that they could have a reliable energy supply. But there actually wasn't enough waste to do that, and they had to double production. And they did some market research, realized that there was a market for doubling production, and then invested in that. And what that actually produced was really a quadruple win for all the stakeholders. So first of all, they cured the public health problem because there was no more waste going into the public areas. They had a reliable electricity supply at the end of this, so that was good for animal welfare. profitability increased, and there were more jobs for local people. So really, it was a win-win-win-win. Um, and that's a kind of example of how you can begin to be a bit more flexible on boundaries and see different possibilities for what could be done, emerging from a situation of conflict. So I'm going to go on to the second area now and talk with you about approaches for understanding complex causality. And the example I'm going to give you is of the approach called system dynamics. It was originally developed by Jay Forrester way back in the 60s. It was originally developed as a computer modeling approach for modeling really complex issues like climate change, but people more recently have done it qualitatively, working with stakeholders to map out the causalities from their points of view. And it can be done very quickly, actually, if you do it in that way. Now, this particular map you see on there, you don't need to know the detail. I've just put it up there so you can see what the kinds of maps look like. It comes from a project that was working with the dairy industry in New Zealand. What had happened here is that the dairy industry is actually worth about $8 billion to the New Zealand economy. That's represents 52% of New Zealand exports. So whenever anything negative is said about the dairy industry, it's front page headlines in New Zealand. And what had happened is some scientists from the institute that I was working in, Government Research Institute, had done some work, and they said that the reason New Zealand has the highest rate of food poisoning in the OECD countries is because dairy cattle were essentially pooing in the rivers, and the bacteria, particularly Campylobacter, was ending up in the water supply because some areas of New Zealand don't have treated water. And as I said, this was front page news. The farmers were absolutely outraged. They were saying this is not their problem. This is a human sewage problem. And the stakeholders really started getting into a serious conflict, and they wouldn't even talk to each other. They wouldn't even come into the same room together. It got to a point where the dairy farmers were saying that they would withdraw cooperation from all the dairy science that was being done in our institute, which would be a massive blow for our institute. So the senior management called my team in and said, we don't need you to solve the problem of food poisoning, but we would like you to help get the stakeholders talking again so that they can at least have a reasonable discussion about how we move forward given this situation. So we worked with the stakeholder groups separately at first because they didn't initially want to come together and talk, and different stakeholder groups built different models of the causality they could see. So this whole area up here is around human sewage system. This whole area around here is around dairy, and there are other bits and pieces as well developed by other stakeholder groups. And once they'd actually developed their own understanding of the causality, then they were willing to talk with each other because my assumption is that they were coming in and they were willing to then justify their understanding of the problem to others because they'd basically worked it out. So we brought them together, and we then pulled the rug out from under them in the sense that instead of asking them to justify their perspectives to others, we asked them to walk around the room and have a look at all the other models that other people had built and work out what in other people's models connected with things in their own models. And across a whole morning, we built up this whole diagram, and it began to dawn on people that it didn't make sense to talk about food poisoning bacteria in one part of the system without also looking at it in others, because there was Campylobacter, it was particularly Campylobacter we were looking at, that was flowing right through the system. And sure enough, there were disagreements still at the end of this, but people were actually willing to talk reasonably because they could see that the boundaries that they had been working with were too limited. The amount of connectivity that they had seen was too limited. No stakeholder had an overall view of the system. And so it was actually possible to learn from each other and get a reasonable conversation going again. So now the third area, and this is about approaches for developing viable and highly responsive organizations. And the example I'm going to give you is the viable system model. This is an approach for either diagnosing problems in an existing organization or designing a new organization if the organization you want to develop doesn't currently exist. Now, this is quite a complex model, so I'm going to simplify it significantly in order to be able to present it in 5 minutes. I should also mention that I'm currently working with Eric Hollab at Warwick and his team, and on a project called Bean Meals that's actually being led out of Oxford. We're using the viable system model to actually design a new organization that is built around the harvesting and distribution of a new bean that's been developed in Warwick that can grow in UK climatic conditions, which will enable us to develop food systems around that bean, whereas previously they were being imported from North America mostly. But that's my only food system example. So the example I'm going to give you to talk you the way through it, so it's not so abstract, is a project we did working with a hospital trust in between waves 2 and 3 of COVID. So we were evaluating the COVID response and the organization of the hospital trust to make recommendations for change so that they could better improve the COVID response for wave 3. So every organization has an environment which it interacts with, and it has to meet some needs in its environment if it's going to be viable. So if it's a private sector organization, these might be customers, and maybe they're producing different products to address the needs of those customers. If it's a hospital, these might be patients with different kinds of health concerns. So a large organization is likely to have multiple operational units. The number ones here are operational units, and they're meeting needs in the environment. So your first task is to segment your environment and work out what are the actual needs that you need to meet, and then to organize your operational units to address those needs. So often, operational units in organizations have been constructed years ago. Needs in the environment change, maybe customer needs change, and there's a need to realign them again. In the hospital trust, these were the wards. So some wards needed to take people with COVID, some wards needed to take people without COVID who'd had serious health conditions like heart attacks, cancer, strokes. And there are also wards for people with both those serious health conditions and COVID. If you've got multiple operational units like that, you need some kind of coordination between those. So in the hospital case, this was things like testing patients to determine which ward people should go on so that you don't inadvertently put a COVID patient on a non-COVID ward. It's about capacity and resourcing, maybe moving staff around when there are COVID peaks. You also need day-to-day management of the organization, which is focused on monitoring the operational performance of these units here. The key principle is management within constraints. So you set the upper and lower limits of viability, and you essentially let these operational units have complete autonomy as long as they're not threatening the viability of the whole system. Now, in the hospital trust, a big part of what we focused on here was KPIs, because the government was telling the hospital trusts to use a particular set of KPIs to measure what was happening with COVID. And that was useful for central government, but their KPIs were totally useless for local management concerns. So we helped them develop a whole set of KPIs, key performance indicators, that would actually help them in their local management. An organization also needs foresight. So it needs to be able to look ahead at what's coming, threats and opportunities in the environment, and the internal capabilities of the organization and capacity of the organization to meet those threats and opportunities. And finally, an organization needs to maintain its identity and ethos um, into the future. So essentially, Stafford Beer, who created this model, said organizations need all five functions. If you take away any one of those functions, then the organization is not viable. And he gave them numbers like this because they don't really correspond to typical words in industry like operations, strategy, management. And he said by giving them numbers, it becomes quite clear that each one is equally important to the others. It's not the case, for example, that senior management are in some senses more important than others. Um, when it came to coordination, sorry, when it came to foresight in the hospital trust, a huge issue was that the region we were working in, its waves were out of step with the rest of the country. So when the government was actually winding down resource provision, they were having to wind up service provision, and predicting when the waves were going to come was a key part of foresight. And in terms of maintaining the ethos, one of the really interesting things was to see how the public and private hospitals were actually collaborating together in a much more fluid way than would normally happen in the health service. So you can use this model at multiple scales. We, for example, could use this at the hospital trust scale. We could use it for individual hospitals. We could use it for the ward. Um, Theoretically, you could go up to national scale, or even look at an international organization using this kind of model. And the kinds of projects that I've applied this in include um, advising a national inquiry, for example, on family violence service systems in New Zealand. So we actually modeled the whole family violence service system using this kind of approach to actually diagnose some of the faults and make recommendations for change. I've used it in multi-agency situations where we've got lots of different organizations and we actually have to work out how they collaborate together. So you put together all the various other functions around those organizations. And the other example I want to give you, though, is the work of one of my ex-students, Pam Sedelko. She actually graduated last year, so this is a recent project. She was working in the United States, and she wanted to develop an interagency system to deal with the interface between international organized crime and local gang violence. And she used Chicago as the example. So what she discovered that made her want to do this project was that the international organized crime organizations recruit from local gangs. And the way you get recruited is basically to kill people. The most violent offenders in local gangs are the ones that get recruited to the really lucrative opportunities in international organized crime. So essentially, you've got a massive escalation in local gang violence as people compete for these recruitment opportunities. And what Pam Sedelko realized is that these organizations were not talking with each other. The police, the local police on the ground, and the people dealing with international organized crime didn't have any kind of relationship together. So she worked with them first on characterizing the highly complex problem. Now, most people, when they see a diagram like this, will say, you can't understand that. Well, actually, the people in the room could understand it because they basically developed parts of it as individuals and then combined it all into one big map. These kinds of systems maps are not useful for communicating with outsiders, but they're very useful when you're dealing with the people in the room who actually created it. And this photo was taken at the point where they were just starting to look at what their organization that joined up these parts of the system was going to look like. And these thick lines on the diagram represent the jurisdictions of the different agencies. And it just became immediately apparent to them that there's no real logic to it, that there are whole parts of the problem that are not being dealt with, and other parts of the problem where there are different agencies all doing different things together. So actually working out how they work together in handling the system was a key part of it. And then they could actually use the viable system model to build an understanding of what functions that they needed to actually coordinate together. And I'm now on the last quadrant here, which is approaches to address conflict and explore multiple perspectives. And the example I'm going to give you is called soft systems methodology. It's one of the uh, approaches that is most widely implemented in the UK. And it's particularly useful for exploring multiple perspectives. So it's a qualitative approach to support learning between people with different views who are trying to manage a really messy, unclear situation. And you can do this either participatively in workshops, or you can do it with a facilitator going between people, interviewing them, checking out understandings, and coming out with some representations that people can learn from. And it starts by mapping the mess that people find themselves in. And they normally, if you're doing this in a workshop, um, it might look something like this. You've got a large sheet of paper on the wall, and everybody gets a pen and they map this. And as they're drawing, they tell other people what they're doing. This particular one comes from a food industry project. This was in an area called Tasman in New Zealand, where there were three large landowners who had realized that the water was over allocated, and they wanted to take more water for irrigation, but the council was saying it's over allocated, you can't take any more. So the council and the landowners worked with us on this project, and we swept in all the stakeholders, including invited everybody in the local area to participate. And this, you don't need to know what's in this diagram, but the people there um, will have understood what's in it. And one of the nice things about drawing a picture like this is that if there are disagreements, then you just put the disagreements in the picture. They're part of the situation that you're dealing with. So people are much more willing to surface disagreements if they know they don't have to deal with them on the spot, but just represent them in the picture. So once you've got that kind of beginning understanding of what the problematic situation is, you can explore possible transformations that different people want to see. And in order to get a better understanding of what those transformations mean, because we often use the same words to mean different things, you can use this kind of mnemonic. Now, this is my version, not Peter Checkland's original version. Um, and you can take a particular stakeholder perspective on a transformation. So let's say that people want to see insufficient irrigation moving to an increase of irrigation by 20%, let's say. And then you could say, well, from what perspective is that being done? So what worldview is being used? So what's transformation? What's the worldview? Who's going to benefit? Who's going to make it happen? When the word owners here means who can stop the transformation from happening. It doesn't mean financial owners. Who would be harmed in the process? Who could be a victim of it? And environmental constraints means what do you have to take as given, which might be the resources you have, it might be the law of the land, there may be any number of things. The point of exploring all of those things is to really get better mutual understanding about what people mean when they say they want a particular transformation or particular change. And you keep as much variety on the table as possible, because what you're doing is getting a lot of ideas about what could happen and not narrowing straight down on what should happen. So once you've actually got those different views of what could happen, what changes could happen, you can map what the activities would be for each of those transformations. Here's an example from a project uh, my team did with the Ministry for Research, Science and Technology in New Zealand. So the ministry had run 4 road mapping exercises on biotech, nanotech, energy and environment research, and they'd met a lot of stakeholder conflict. They were about to get involved in doing a food roadmap. So this is roadmaps for 30-year investment plans into these controversial areas of science and technology. And they were saying, before we get into food, which, because it's such a huge part of the New Zealand economy, is bound to be at least as conflictual as some of these others, we want to actually work out what's gone wrong that's created these conflicts. So we were asked to evaluate the process by which they set up these roadmaps. Now, again, you don't need to know the detail here, but this map represents what they did before our intervention, and then there was another map for what they moved to for the food roadmap. The key element here is that they did a lot of setup of these roadmaps. So they formed a steering group, they developed templates, they essentially did the framing. And then they took those ideas out for public consultation. And unsurprisingly, people were saying, well, my concern is not in there. You're not going to be funding the research that I want to be doing. There was a lot of stakeholder conflict around this. And the solution was really very simple: to do public consultation before you actually do the pre-framing, so that the framing can be much more inclusive. And we then followed up the ministry colleagues with when they were doing their food roadmap, and it was a completely different atmosphere. There was really very little conflict, and very constructive public meetings were being held. Now, once you've got a whole set of transformations that different people want to see, and you've got clear pictures of what the activities are that would be put into place to implement those transformations, you can begin to compare back to that earlier picture of the mess and look for accommodations and agree changes. This is now where you hone down on actionable change. The word accommodations on that slide is really important, because what it doesn't mean is consensus in a large, complex problem situation with multiple stakeholders. You're unlikely to get everybody agreeing on everything, but you can still find next steps that people can agree can be taken. It also doesn't mean compromise. I try to avoid the word compromise, because most people then think I'm going to have to give up something, and that puts them in a defensive mode. The whole idea of an accommodation is that you're looking for something that comes out of the learning between people. And often it's something that they wouldn't have thought about at the beginning of the whole process. So I'll give you an example. So this is a project from the late 90s, actually, when we were asked to help a multi-agency group. There were 19 different agencies collaborating to try to develop a counselling response that could be activated in the event of a disaster. And these organisations had been meeting for 18 months. They had a 2.5-hour meeting every Wednesday evening, and they'd reached 3 months before a statutory deadline when they had to have their plans in place. But they just couldn't agree. And it was such a mess. They asked us to help with it. We did 6 days of workshops with them and came out with plans that were implemented. And the reason there's a train crash on the picture is that 6 months after these were implemented, there was a train crash in the local region, and the newspapers made particular mention of the quality of the counselling support. And what I mean by those accommodations is that they realised through the discussion that some people wanted to have a paid counselling service, so full-time paid counsellors. Other people wanted volunteers. And then they began to realize you can't pay people to just wait until a disaster happens. That's just a waste of resources. Neither can you expect volunteers to know what to do in the event of a disaster. So the solution was an emergent one, that we have a paid team of trainers who train the volunteers. And nobody had actually thought of that solution until it emerged in those workshops. And that's a good example of an accommodation. So at this point, I'm drawing to a close. And just to recap, I've talked about 4 systems thinking skills. So thinking in terms of boundaries, interrelationships, whole systems and their emergent properties, and multiple perspectives. I've presented some examples of systems approaches that can help you use those systems thinking skills to achieve particular purposes, like getting better mutual understanding, mapping complex causality, developing better organizations. And I just want to leave you with 3 systemic principles for managing these kinds of complex problems. So the first one is explore boundaries. So who's involved? Whose voices do you need to listen to? What issues do you need to account for? What values matter? What things should people be doing, and what could be done? And look for processes of conflict and marginalization up front. The reason to do that is you don't even know what stakeholder perspectives you've got, or relationships you've got, or emergent properties you've got, until you begin to do some initial exploration of boundaries. And then you can revisit boundaries as and when the situation changes. I would say also that you can draw upon mixed methods from across a range of different systems approaches. I'm not a purist at all. I like to creatively design things that are responsive to the local context. And you can use methods from the natural and social sciences as well. And that might be a strange thing to say, but to me, being systemic is all about the thinking that you put into designing the project to be as responsive as you can to the context. It's not so much in the methods themselves. So quite conventional methods can often be used as part of a systems approach. And the third principle is that if you've got no previous experience or very limited experience, start from where you are. There's actually nowhere else you can start. So try new methods when the need arises, and build your capabilities for the longer term. So, I mean, I've been in this work now for 40 years, and I'm still as uncomfortable as when I started out, and I deliberately keep myself in that state, because as I go, I'll always be seeing if I can use a new approach, so I can continue to learn and build my skills in the longer term. So it becomes a bit of a life project. And if I can just leave you very quickly with 2 cartoons that kind of illustrate what systems thinking is useful for. So, as I know we've got people outside the UK on, and not everybody knows the story of the blind men and the elephant. The idea here is that there's a whole set of blind men. They're all feeling an elephant, but they don't identify it as an elephant because they can't see it. And so one thinks the ear is a leaf, for example. One thinks its side is a brick wall. And what systems thinking can do is give you some ideas, some language, some tools to get a better understanding of the highly complex problem that you're dealing with. Um, and that's really kind of an essential need in the kinds of food system issues that we're dealing with. But there's also a second problem. It's not just that you can't see the whole. Um, and the second problem, in some ways, is even worse. And this is when everybody think they know the answer and they're wrong. So in this case, they all think it's an elephant and it's not an elephant. And that's what we call groupthink. So this is when people are either have a very limited understanding and they don't see the complexity that's there with them, or they're even sometimes colluding not to say not to speak about elements of the situation that are particularly difficult. And one final example from practice on this. So way back in the early 90s, I was asked to do a consultancy with a couple of colleagues with the Central Water Company of Peru, who were about to be privatized and split into 9 constituency companies. And we met with the senior management of the company, and they were saying this is essentially a business problem because they need to know if there's a role for a statutory body at the end of this, or whether they're essentially going to be making themselves redundant. And I was really quite concerned that they were only seeing it as a business problem because water's an ecological resource. So I said, I'll only do this if we can widen the boundaries of participation, and let's get an ecologist in the room. They agreed to this. So the first day, they were just fruitlessly exploring this as a business problem. And because it was getting quite frustrating that they weren't able to see things in other ways, I asked the ecologist to start the second day. And she put a chart on the wall of all the rivers in Peru and showing the aquifers joining up the rivers underground. And she was explaining this. And one of the senior managers there just shouted out, so you mean to say if one of these companies doesn't do its job properly and it allows the water to be polluted, then everybody else's water will be affected too? And she said, absolutely. And of course, they realized that you needed some kind of independent monitoring in that situation to keep the players honest. So I think one of the lovely things I've seen is policymakers, for example, really get in government and industry and NGOs really begin to get these kinds of aha moments. And it's when you see those aha moments emerging in practice that is the most kind of rewarding thing, I think, from my point of view, of doing this kind of systems practice. So with that, I'll end the presentation and open up for questions and comments. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gerald. If you can stop sharing your slides, that would be great. That was really interesting. Thank you. I felt like I started not really knowing much about systems thinking at all, and that was a real whistle-stop tour. So I'm sure everyone's learnt a lot. Thank you. I'm going to start with a question from Dan Crossley, who's the Chief Exec of the Food Ethics Council. It's a really good question to start on. He said, you mentioned that systems thinking itself reached a tipping point around 7 years ago. How can we build positive momentum to reach tipping points in the context of wanting better, i.e., fairer, more sustainable and healthier food systems?
Yeah, so I'll say a little bit about what's happened in government because I think it provides a good model of what can be done. Um, so how many years ago? 2022, there was a community of practice for systems thinking in central government, and they had 300 members. By 2023, to double to 600. 2024 now, it's over 700. So that's a really successful community of practice. And I mean, they've obviously done things well, and we can learn from that kind of model. I'm sure that I've got colleagues in DEFRA, for example, that I work with who are in part of the organisation of that. And I'm sure they would be willing to talk with people about setting up those kinds of communities of practice. The other thing that I think is really useful is that we now have apprentices in systems thinking. So I think there are 9 apprenticeship programs across the UK. I mean, they're all really good. I actually teach on the Birmingham one, just a little bit of freelance teaching. Um, and if because you're going to be paying business organizations and government organizations are going to be paying the tax anyway. Actually, you can recoup some of those costs by putting your employees on the apprenticeship, and that's a good way to build capabilities.
Okay. So are there any sectors that you would say where there is a big gap in people who are looking at systems thinking and who have those skills? Which sectors tend to be tend to have more people? Is it government? Like you said, that's been a really big growth there. But how does industry compare to that? Are there certain sectors within industry, or how do NGOs and think tanks compare? Like what's that picture look like?
Um, well, it's not as nearly as it's not nearly as spread as it needs to be.
Yeah.
So certainly it's improving in government significantly. You regularly now see jobs for systems thinkers, especially at local government level. Some NGOs have quite good systems thinking capabilities. So Oxfam is a good example of that. Um, the Royal Society, well, actually they've spun off that element. Some of you may know Sue Pritchard in the Rural Livelihoods Commission. I mean, she's a systems thinker. She used that for the inquiry that she ran, for the commission that she ran recently. Um, so, I mean, it's patchy, to be honest. And in industry, there are people around. For example, organisations like oh dear, aerospace systems. I've just lost the name of it. I mean, they have systems thinkers within it. It tends to be more of an engineering form of systems thinking,
Mm.
but they also have people more doing the kinds of things I'm doing. Not as nearly as much as we need though. And the other thing that is a little bit of a barrier at the moment is the fact that we're not back to pre-COVID ways of working. So there's limited approaches that work well online, and we need to deal with that as a priority, I think, in the systems thinking community.
Mm.
Um, and that's hard because if you want to develop tools, they're not online tools will need a significant investment in developing them. So there's a bit of a time lag there where people are still doing a lot of face-to-face work, and we need to get over that hump and find more online ways of working.
Mm. I guess it's a challenge as well if you've got a lot of systems thinkers in one sort of group, but then maybe not in another, and everyone needs to understand the value of it, getting those people to sort of all work together. Um,
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, what I would say is that we're at that stage now where people are beginning. Most people have heard of it, but there are still some myths out there. So one of them that I hear regularly is that this is about getting comprehensive understanding, and that is really a potentially dangerous myth because it's impossible for any human being to have comprehensive understanding. What systems thinking allows us to do is deal better with the inevitable lack of comprehensiveness because it helps you explore boundaries and look at different perspectives and those kinds of things. And that's significantly different. And when I'm teaching, I tell the students, don't just accept it if your managers say this, this is about being more comprehensive, because they'll have unrealistic expectations of you, and that'll rebound both on you and people's understanding of systems thinking.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of education to do. It's obviously not it there way back there were a couple of degrees in systems thinking. Now you kind of find it woven into other courses. We need to we need to develop that a lot more.
Mm. Thank you. I'm going to move to some other questions. We've got quite a few now. So this is from Stephen Jacobs. So Steve works with organic farmers, and he's asking, are there any examples where persistent mis or disinformation has been overcome via systems thinking? And if so, how? So he's given the example of, for example, a government agency holds a consultation, but after the results are published, stakeholders feel aggrieved and that their concerns have kind of been ignored. The agency says they've not been, and there becomes a sort of impasse. So yes, the question is around how do you deal with that sort of misinformation, and that sort of blockage.
Yeah, just for clarification, so that example didn't sound like misinformation. It sounded like somebody um, excluding a perspective, or or making a non-transparent boundary judgment. Is that right?
Yes, I suppose yes, I suppose it does. So I think if we just go for the first part of the question, which is maybe clearer, which is, are there any examples where persistent mis or disinformation has been overcome, and if so, how?
Um, yeah, so the example I gave of the system dynamics project, where we were looking at the Campylobacter food poisoning issue, and in exploring that situation, when all of these stakeholders are really angry with each other, and the farmers union was at one point threatening to withdraw from the science projects. I initially had meetings with a number of the key stakeholders to find out their perspectives, and there was a union leader who I will not name, but they sat down with me and said, I'm prepared to lie, deny the science, anything in the interests of my members.
Oh, wow.
And this person was very, very influential. So we knew we had an issue of how we were going to actually manage this. And what we decided to do is set up that when we did bring the stakeholders together, set up a workshop that brought a number of her senior members in with her, who we knew were more open-minded and wouldn't react like that. So there were 5 or 6 people who would basically prevent that from happening. And we never had to tell them. They had reputations of being ethical people, and basically she didn't do what she'd threatened to do. So there are ways around it, and I mean there's quite, you can get some good myth busting through through these kinds of approaches. There's another example I've got, which is another food system example, actually. Project I did with a colleague, Karen Cronin, in New Zealand, where it was right at the height of the genetic modification debate, and there were demonstrations in the streets. Scientists having bricks thrown through their windows. I mean, it was really quite nasty at that time. And at the height of that, Karen brought together 12 leaders, a mix of kind of spiritual leaders, science leaders, industry leaders, from companies, using genetic modification technology and things. And we went through a whole process of looking at what is at the heart of the matter for these different stakeholders. So we've done a lot of work beforehand at kind of mapping out their perspectives before we went into the room. And it each basically started with stereotypes of the others. And it was shocking to everybody when everybody realized that the environmental issues were at the heart of the matter for all the stakeholders, every single one. And the campaigners didn't realize, for example, that scientists were doing science that was looking at those environmental issues, horizontal gene transfer, and that sort of thing. And and a lot of the scientists kind of had a stereotype of the campaigners that they were just against it for some kind of reactionary reasons. And then what emerged out of that was a much more subtle understanding of there are situations where it's worth doing the genetic experimentation. For example, if there's a health gain, and there are situations where it's not. If the only gain is profitability, then the risks are not worth it. Some more subtle understandings came out, but the biggest change was really in people's understanding of each other.
And that sounds like, especially with something like the food system, it's there are all these different interests, and often it comes down to people's livelihoods, people's health, all these sorts of things, and it can be really polarized. And like you said, people pit against each other. Would you say that's the most challenging thing of using systems thinking, is overcoming those sort of oppositions, or what are those the most challenging things of systems thinking that people tend to sort of find? And with that in mind, what would you say are the kind of common pitfalls to avoid when trying to use systems thinking, bearing in mind that there are a lot of people on this call who this is probably quite new to, so if they're kind of just starting out.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot in that question. Um, Well, certainly conflict is a big one. Coercion is also a significant one. I've had several situations where people were not able or willing to talk in front of each other because of power relations. So a key pitfall is not exploring the situation up front, and especially these boundaries about who you're going to talk to and what are the relationships between people. And even though I was aware of that, I still make mistakes sometimes. I can remember a dire workshop. This is maybe 20 years ago now, where we were looking at the design of a new employment project for people with mental health problems. And the this particular guy went to the loo at one point, and suddenly everybody talked to me and said, "We can't talk in front of him." And
Yeah.
I just had to find another way around it. You check it out, check out people's relationships, ask them specifically ahead of time. Um, other issues are there are some organisations that just are not willing to have workshops. They just say it's too disruptive of their business as usual. I like to point out, like in the disasters planning one I mentioned, 6 days of workshops is less than a third of the time that they'd already met every Wednesday evening. If you add it up, so there's efficiency there. Um, I mean, in some ways, there's pros and cons. Often people leave it until they're in an absolutely desperate state. But that's in some ways that's a good thing because then they're really willing to take the plunge and learn and change. Um, yeah, I think
Great,
that's
thank
that's
you.
it as far as that's
um
concerned.
We've got a very good question here, which I think is sort of related, from someone who's anonymous. They're going to say, food links in so many areas, as I was kind of already saying, which means that it's hard to draw boundaries around food systems. What advice do you have about drawing boundaries so that we're including as many perspectives as possible, but not including everyone and everything so that it becomes overwhelming?
Yeah, that's right. So the the work on boundaries has gone through several different steps of development, and it's worth saying because the starting point way back in the 60s was people saying, um, let's push out the boundaries as far as possible, as long as it's not overwhelming. But basically, the wider your boundary is, the more ethical it is. And but in practical situations, that's not always possible. So uh, a key innovation came in the early 80s, where a guy called Werner Ulrich said that this is not about being completely inclusive, it's about justifying the boundaries that you're using. Realizing that you're going to have boundaries, whatever, because you can't be comprehensive. We assume that everything in the world is either directly or indirectly connected with everything else, and so everybody has a partial understanding. So the question is, how well can you justify that? Can you have the discussions among people and justify both uh, the inclusion and exclusions of people, inclusions and exclusions of issues, and the time boundaries. And what I found is that if you can be more transparent about those, about when the stopping points for dialogue are, for example, then people are more willing to accept it.
Mm.
It's the lack of transparency that angers people more than anything else.
Okay, good tip to know. Just thinking with, with boundary drawing and everything else around the sort of approach to what sort of systems thinking approach you might take, does that change when you're dealing with something very urgent? So, for example, obviously this network is dealing with essentially climate change and how we reduce those emissions in the food system very, very quickly. Um, does that sort of change the approach? Because I imagine if it feels like there's a lot of time to sort of work something out, you can keep the boundaries wider in a sense, can't you? You can kind of make it more complex and have that time to sort of chew it over. But what do you do when there's a sort of urgent need to make change?
Yeah. So there are different modes of systems thinking. Um, there are the kinds of processes I've discussed today, but there's also keeping things, building these skills in your own mind. So, I mean, I worked for a little while with a woman in New Zealand who was the civil servant who's in charge of emergency planning for things like earthquakes, and she stepped into the Christchurch earthquake, for example. Now, in that situation, there were people, there were hundreds of agencies all descending on an area. People been made homeless, water supply had gone, quite an emergency situation. So, of course, the council had to act um, without a huge amount of consultation. Now, there was a lot of disquiet amongst the local people about how that response had happened. My feeling is that if you've actually internalized some of those thinking skills, then you can begin to make those kinds of decisions on the fly. So, maybe you can't consult the whole population, but you can consult key people. There's enough time to just do that and make it transparent that you've done that. Um, there there are there are ways you can be a little bit more systemic, even though you're having to do things really fast.
Okay, thank you.
And the other thing is you can build this into governance. So there's another good food systems example actually from Christchurch, because the so I was involved in a project where there's a massive conflict over water resources, where um, farmers were pretty much refusing to obey the water restrictions that the council were putting in place, and they were taking the council to court. The council was spending more on legal bills than actually on environmental enforcement, and so a guy called Brian Jenkins, who was chief executive, broke this by doing a massive public consultation and then brought together 20 leaders who from different stakeholder groups who we worked with for a few days, actually looking at how all of the issues, there were 10 major decision issues ranging from climate change through to water quantity and quality and loads of things, how they all intersected. And one of the major changes that came out of it was a change in governance. So we had catchment boards and multi-stakeholder groups governing those. And the principle was that you don't make gains in one area at the expense of another. So if you're, for example, going to take more water for irrigation, you also put in environmental mitigation measures, and so cooperation emerged out of competition. If you can build those things into governance, then um, when the crisis happens, the relationships are there and of a high quality in order to be able to deal with that kind of crisis. The same is true of the Tasman, that when we did that feasibility for a water storage dam, um, it they had really exceptionally good relationships between the stakeholders. And although there was conflict about whether there should be a dam or not, they had the relationships in place to actually be able to deal with that.
I mean, it does sound from your whole talk really and all the examples you've given that relationship management and people management is really key. And sort of, psychology, understanding the psychology of people is really critical to systems thinking.
It
Um,
is, and I would say not to view this as managing your stakeholders, because
yeah,
that's an instrumental attitude. This is really about relationships. If you take that kind of instrumental attitude, people know it and they don't trust
yeah.
it.
So it's more
It's
facilitation, I guess, facilitation
yeah,
and bridge building.
yeah.
Um, so, I mean, slightly related to that, a question from Neil Ward. He's saying, are there some academic disciplines that are more suited to systems thinking? And I would add on to that, are there some industries or sectors that seem to be more suited to systems thinking, and are there others where it feels a bit more challenging?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, most farmers that I've met have been almost natural systems thinkers. I mean, you can't
Mm.
work on the land without understanding some of those relationships. Um, but there's different elements of this. So I mean, obviously, disciplines like ecology foster a more systemic outlook, but I don't know if the always the subtlety of understanding your own understanding and this, thinking about your own thinking, the metacognition that comes with this is always there. So you certainly have a really good understanding of ecological relationships, but the whether people have the understanding of how we create meaning, the fact what the way we work is that we construct our own realities based on past expectations, which means we don't see the world that's there. We see what we expect. Now, whether people that's really got through yet, I don't think it has. I think that's really the next step where we're going to really get that idea popularized, because then this is about helping to rethink and not simply about developing a single understanding of what, for example, the ecology is.
But imagine it also is, how do you understand when you're in a group think? If you're in the group think, how do you know that you're in the group think sometimes?
Yeah, and it depends what I mean, there are different kinds of groupthink. Some of them people are very well aware of. I mean, I've been in organizations where I know there's undiscussables and you just don't raise that issue.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, there are other forms. Yeah, well, and there are things you can do. I mean, there are really clear things you can do. You can talk to other stakeholders who might have a different perspective. You can deliberately widen the boundaries and look for what the things you know about are interacting with. You know,
Mm.
there are very specific steps that you can do, and it kind of becomes natural thing after you've done it for a while. It just becomes the way you think.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. So yeah, it's sort of practice as well. We're going to whiz through a couple more questions. We've got some really good questions from people. From Petra, she says, "How do you balance looking at the wider boundaries and focusing on the details in an area like, food system change or climate change adaptation?"
Um, well, I mean, this is about how you. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of general issue, isn't it? That so there are multiple scales that you can be looking at. And I guess it depends on the issue of how you map it out. I would say So there are some people who write about how there are particular boundaries that you always must look at, like, for example, global scale boundaries. Um, and there are other people like myself who say, um, well, you've got to be a bit more flexible than that, because you've really got to be thinking about the different issues and how they relate. Um, and I mean, and it really matters, I guess, if you a key thing is to frame it at a scale at which you can create change. So I'm just thinking of a particular issue that, I mean, I read about this project, but I wrote in response to the people doing it. So it was somebody campaigning, supporting people who were campaigning against a school closure, and it became really obvious that they were never going to stop this school being closed down. And I said to them, um, you were actually working at the wrong level there. As soon as you realised that this was really a lost cause, it became a waste of time to do that. You could have actually worked at more the lobbying at the policy level to actually change there. So you've got to find the scale at which you can make a
Okay.
difference.
Yeah. And a question from Morton Vin Bisbee. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Can I say it
Um,
again?
Morton Vin Bisbee says,
Okay.
I've been introduced to James G. Miller living systems theory as a scaffold, using it to help shift perspectives. Um, do you know anything about that? And do you have kind of any thoughts on whether it's still relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I do know it. In fact, I met Miller years ago, and he died quite a long time ago. But I met him when I was kind of junior researcher. Um, I do think it's interesting. I have seen it used for dubious ways. So I think, you know, certainly in the agricultural area, it could be really useful. But I've seen it used in defence applications where I've really thought, I'm not sure that this is ethical. What's being done? That's what. Yes. Uh, um, So I think it's relevant, but I think there are also lots of more recent ideas that are really important as well, like panarchy, for example. So to understand how ecosystems cycle, how social systems cycle, and that's, as far as I'm aware, not in Miller's work. So I would use it, but I would add other things into.
Yeah, thank you. Well, maybe we can afterwards I can get some I don't know tips from you or you know suggestions of places people can go for more information on systems thinking. But we're going to end it there. Gerald, thank you so much for your insights. We've had people from all over the world joining, from India, the US, Netherlands, Denmark, across the UK. So thank you. It's been really
I saw
interesting.
somebody from New Zealand as well, which
Yeah.
must be middle of the night from them.
Yes, it was real dedication. So yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll be putting this on YouTube, so there was a lot of information to take in. So if you want to watch it back, please do. We'll be sharing that in the next few days. Our next webinar is on using beans to test systems thinking for food system transformation. So Gerald's going to be back with us on the 19th of June at 10 a.m. with Professor John Ingram. Going to be looking at that. So a bit more of a kind of applied, I guess, applied example of systems thinking. So we'll be sharing that soon on email and on social media. So if you're not already signed up to AFM, please do. In the meantime, you can also browse our back catalogue on YouTube if you've missed any previous webinars, and get in touch with Neil or myself if you want to suggest a topic or a speaker. So otherwise, we will see you all again soon. Thank you very much. And I will just put in the chat again the links. But yeah, thank you all very much. All right, thanks, Gerald.
Okay, thank you.